There is a version of Willie Nelson that the world has always preferred to believe in. The Rolling Stone who bears no grudges. The philosopher in a bandana who laughs at the IRS and plays another chord. The man who seems, somehow, to have floated above 70 years of heartbreak, betrayal, and industry warfare on a cloud of goodwill and smoke. That version is not entirely wrong. But it is not entirely complete, either. Because Willie Nelson remembers. He has always remembered. Beneath the unshakable grin and the road-worn serenity lives a man who was shaped by Abbott, Texas, during the Great Depression, who clawed his way into Nashville only to be told his voice was wrong, his songs too strange, his vision too peculiar for the polished machinery of Music Row. He wrote Crazy for Patsy Cline and watched other people get rich off his talent. He returned to Texas in 1972 not as a retreat but as an act of war. He built something real in Austin, something raw and unvarnished, and he spent the next 5 decades defending it. Tired of Music Row's rules, Nelson returned to Texas and sparked the outlaw country era alongside Waylon Jennings, challenging the industry and embracing a rawer approach that appealed to younger, rebellious listeners. Ad hoc news. A man who fights that hard for something authentic will inevitably find himself in conflict with those he believes are selling it short. At 92, having outlived most of his rivals and many of his closest friends, Willie Nelson carries a list of names that the industry has always whispered about but rarely spoken plainly. These are not enemies in the Hollywood sense. They are something more complicated than that, people who disappointed him, people who used him, people whose choices he took as a personal insult to the music he had given his entire life to protect. Here are 7 of them. Willie Nelson never had much patience for spectacle pretending to be substance. So when Garth Brooks arrived in the early 1990s and turned country music into something closer to stadium rock, pyrotechnics, costume changes, an alter ego named Chris Gaines, Willie watched with the quiet, weary skepticism of a man who had spent 20 years fighting for the opposite. Nashville celebrated Brooks as the savior of country music. Willie saw a man who had figured out how to borrow country's emotional language while replacing its bones with something shinier. The tensions between the outlaw generation and the arena country wave were real and documented. Waylon Jennings, Willie's closest collaborator in the outlaw movement, was famously cool toward Brooks, and those who ran in Willie's circles shared his reservations about what big production country represented. To Willie, the guitar was never a prop. You either earned the weight of it or you didn't. Brooks was commercially undeniable. Willie's position was that commercial success and artistic truth were not the same thing, and confusing them was the first step toward losing the music entirely. Saving country music. The years have softened the edges of this particular grudge more than most. Willie is too old and too wise to maintain pure hostility towards someone who, whatever else he was, genuinely loved the genre. But the underlying tension, between the man who lived the outlaw life and the man who performed it on a stage the size of a football field, never fully dissolved. No name on this list carries the weight that this one does, and no relationship in Willie's long life captures the particular agony of loving someone who could also wound you like no stranger ever could. Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings built the outlaw movement together, eventually joining with Johnny Cash and Chris Christopherson to form the Highwaymen supergroup, which Nelson described as the most fun I ever had before or since. They were not just friends or collaborators. They were the same person from different angles, 2 men who had refused to bend to Nashville's machinery and paid enormous prices for that refusal. Their bond was sealed in the kind of shared suffering that creates either brotherhood or bitterness, and for most of their lives it created both simultaneously. Cheat sheet. Willie once described their dynamic openly. Waylon and I were like 2 old married people. We fought about everything, and if he was for it, I was against it. And you know, that's kind of the way it was. But we were great friends. That last sentence did a great deal of work. The fighting was real. The resentments were real. Waylon's classic song Bob Wills Is Still the King was actually born from a fight the two had over a booking disagreement. Waylon later admitted he wrote it because he was mad at Willie and wanted to send him a message. Whiskey riff, whiskey riff. By the late years of Waylon's life, the friendship had developed fissures that neither man's pride would allow them to properly address. There were reports that Willie did not attend Waylon's funeral after Jennings died in 2002, and persistent discussion in outlaw country circles about a period of estrangement between them, though the full truth has never been clearly established. What is clear is that Willie, in the years since, has spoken of Waylon with the particular tenderness of a man who carries unresolved grief, love that ran out of time before it could settle its accounts. Saving country music. Willie Nelson's objection to Shania Twain was never personal, and that almost made it worse. It is easier to forgive someone who betrays you than to forgive someone who simply represents a direction you believe is destroying something irreplaceable. Shania Twain arrived in the mid-1990s and did something remarkable. She made country music explode into territories it had never reached, selling tens of millions of records to audiences who had never owned a country album before. The industry called it a triumph. Willie Nelson watched the sequined outfits, the pop crossover production, and the shrinking distance between Nashville and the mainstream charts, and he called it something else entirely. Willie's entire artistic identity was built on the rejection of Nashville's polished, commercial sound in favor of something grittier and more authentic. Twain's music was the opposite philosophy taken to its logical conclusion, maximally polished, maximally accessible, strategically designed to appeal to people who didn't necessarily want to be challenged. That she was enormously talented made it more frustrating, not less. The issue was never whether she could sing. The issue was what she was singing toward, and what was being left behind. Ad hoc news. Willie has never made a public statement of hostility toward Twain, which is consistent with his character. He speaks in suggestions, not declarations. But the absence of collaboration, of tribute, of warmth, those absences say things that words do not need to. This one is the sharpest edge on the list, and also the most documented. The famous tension between the political world Willie Nelson inhabited and the patriotic country machine that Toby Keith represented came to a head backstage at Willie's own 70th birthday concert at the Beacon Theater in New York in 2003, where Kris Kristofferson and a country star widely understood to be Toby Keith allegedly had a heated confrontation about the political tone of the evening. Whether that exact exchange occurred precisely as reported remains contested. What is not contested is the fundamental incompatibility between the two men's visions of what country music was supposed to do. American songwriter. Toby Keith's 2002 hit Courtesy of the Red, White and Blue with its explicit threat of military retribution was the clearest possible statement of a philosophy Willie Nelson found antithetical to everything he believed music was for. Willie had spent his career singing about loss, longing, wandering, and the complicated dignity of ordinary American lives. He had written protest songs. He had played for farm workers and marched for causes. To him, the guitar was a tool for honesty, not for stoking the emotions that sent young men to their deaths in foreign countries while older men cheered from safe distances. CBS News. Even in his 90s, Willie has remained committed to progressive political causes and controversial associations, from endorsing Democratic candidates to lending his voice to Beyoncé's Cowboy Carter, all while maintaining that his music itself is rarely overtly political. That distinction mattered enormously to him. Music that explored truth was one thing. Music that dressed up war in a flag and called it country was something he could not respect, and did not. NPR. Kris Kristofferson is the most unexpected name on this list, because these two men were, for a long time, as close as brothers. They shared stages and studio sessions through the Highwaymen supergroup years alongside Johnny Cash and Waylon Jennings, and Willie described those tours as some of the most joyful periods of his entire career. Cheat sheet. The friendship between Willie and Kris was built on mutual respect for what the other had sacrificed in the name of artistic truth. Kristofferson had given up a Rhodes Scholarship and a military career to write songs in Nashville, arriving with nothing and building a catalog that included Me and Bobby McGee, Sunday Morning Comin' Down, and Help Me Make It Through the Night. He understood Willie's world from the inside. Which is why the fracture, when it came, hit the way it did. The details are the kind that get softened in the retelling, a moment of careless talk, a word that carried a meaning its speaker may not have fully intended, and a recipient who had too much pride and too much pain to absorb it with grace. Willie's silence on the subject of what ultimately estranged them is itself the loudest testimony available. He does not speak of Christopherson the way he speaks of strangers who disappointed him. He speaks the way a person speaks about someone they loved and lost in a way that cannot quite be undone. Of all the relationships on this list, Merle Haggard and Willie Nelson represent the one that came closest to genuine brotherhood. They were not just contemporaries or collaborators. They were mirrors, two men from hardscrabble beginnings, both formed by real poverty, real trouble, and real music, who had found in each other a recognition that almost nobody else could offer. Merle Haggard, along with Willie Nelson and Chris Christopherson, helped push the boundaries of country music by rejecting the Nashville polish in favor of something rawer and more personal. Haggard had done time in San Quentin. Willie had been through his own set of disasters, failed marriages, industry battles, an IRS debt that once resulted in his property being seized and auctioned. Neither man had the luxury of pretending that life was easy or that music was entertainment. For both of them, music was survival. Factual America. The trouble between them was born from the specific cruelty of in-jokes that land wrong. Haggard had a way of running his mouth on stage, turning the things he loved into punchlines as a form of affection that didn't always translate. Willie had spent his entire life defending the things he believed in against people who didn't take them seriously. When Haggard's humor crossed that line, even unintentionally, even in front of a crowd that was laughing with them rather than at them, Willie received it as a kind of public diminishment. And Willie Nelson, for all his apparent serenity, has never easily forgiven those who made him small. When Merle Haggard died in 2016 on his birthday, Willie's tribute was measured. The words were respectful. The warmth was complicated. Two men who had been closer than most brothers, separated at the end by something that the wrong word in the wrong moment can build, a wall made of pride that neither one of them ever quite managed to dismantle completely. If the previous names on this list carry the weight of long history and genuine love gone wrong, Kid Rock represents something different, the specific annoyance of a man who mistakes loudness for substance and ego for artistic vision. Willie Nelson has collaborated with everyone. Snoop Dogg, Julio Iglesias, Leon Russell. He is not a purist in the narrow sense. What he is, irreducibly and without apology, is someone who believes that music must mean something, that it has to come from a place of truth and arrive at a place of truth, or the whole exercise is just expensive noise. Kid Rock represented, to Willie's ear, the triumph of posture over content. The Detroit grit was real enough, and the energy was undeniable, but the substance beneath the swagger was, in Willie's estimation, thin. When the two found themselves in professional proximity, the details of exactly what went wrong varying depending on who is doing the telling, Willie's exit was characteristically quiet and final. He did not yell. He did not issue a statement. He simply removed himself and declined to return. In Willie Nelson's world, that is about as damning a verdict as a man can deliver. At 92 years old, Willie Nelson has outlived most of his feuds and survived every attempt the music industry, the IRS, and time itself have made to diminish him. He has released his 154th overall studio album, lent his voice to Beyoncé's Cowboy Carter, and duet with Orville Peck on what was called a gay cowboy anthem, all at an age when most artists are receiving Lifetime Achievement Awards and declining interview requests. He is still working. He is still fighting. He is still, in the most essential sense, himself. NPR. The list of people who hurt him, who disappointed him, who failed to meet the standard he has always held for what music and friendship and honesty require, that list is real. He once said of Waylon, "We were great friends all the way." Those last four words carrying an entire complicated history inside them. That is how Willie Nelson carries most things, not with bitterness or score settling, but with the quiet, unflinching memory of a man who has always known the difference between what he was told and what was actually true. Whiskey Riff. In an industry built on performance, he is one of the last people left who insists on the real thing. And if that insistence cost him friendships and collaborations and comfortable professional silences, if it left him standing alone at the edge of more than a few stages, arms crossed, watching something he loved being done wrong, then that was the price. He paid it. He is still paying it. And if you know anything about Willie Nelson at all, you know he would not have it any other way.